Sometimes kindness comes disguised as an indecent proposal, and sometimes pride prevents us from seeing the outstretched hand when we need it most. Margaret watched her daughter's bare feet as she walked down the dusty street of Cedar Falls. The midday sun turned the dry land into small clouds of dust that stuck to the sweaty skin. Sarah, only 8 years old, followed in her mother's footsteps without complaint, but Margaret saw how the girl tread carefully, avoiding the sharpest stones. The last shoes had lasted until last winter, and since then mother and daughter have walked barefoot through the world. The widow was 32 years old and had calloused hands from washing other people's clothes in the stream that ran after the boarding house. He had arrived in Cedar Falls 6 months ago, carrying only a worn-out leather suitcase, and a daughter who asked too many questions about her father, who never came home. Margaret didn't talk about Thomas. She didn't explain why he left on a Tuesday morning, and left only a note on the kitchen table. Some wounds were too deep to be exposed to the desert sun. The laundry job barely paid enough for the tiny room they shared in the back of Mrs. Coleman's boarding house. Margaret would wake up before dawn and rub fabrics until her hands bled, but the money never reached the basic necessities. Sarah ate once a day, sometimes twice when there was something left over from the boarding house dinner. The girl never complained, but Margaret saw the way she looked at the other children in the city, sidewalks and well-fed. It was on one of those hot afternoons, when Margaret was hanging sheets on the makeshift clothesline behind the boarding house, that she saw the man approaching. William Fletcher was 45 years old and owned the largest ranch around Cedar Falls. He had lost his wife in the birth of his second child 3 years earlier, and since then he has raised both boys alone. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than entire speeches. Margaret knew Fletcher's reputation. He was fair in business, paid his workers on time, and had never been involved in the bar fights that occasionally shook the city. Widowed like her, but with enough resources not to need to wash other people's clothes to survive. When he stopped in front of the clothesline and took off his hat in a show of respect, Margaret felt something in her stomach that she couldn't tell if it was hope or fear. The proposal came directly, bluntly, like everything that came out of William Fletcher's mouth. He watched Sarah playing with pebbles in the dirt, and then stared at Margaret with eyes that had seen a lot in life. The offer was simple: a home for her and her daughter, honest work taking care of his house and children, and in return she would become his wife. Not out of love, he made it clear, but out of mutual necessity. His cabin needed a woman, and Sarah needed shoes. Margaret felt the blood rise up her face. The first reaction was indignation, as if Fletcher had suggested something dishonorable. But when she looked at her daughter's feet, at the cramped room where they lived, at her own hands destroyed by bleach, indignation gave way to a confusion of feelings that she did not know how to name. Fletcher was not offering charity. It was an agreement, an honest transaction between two people who needed each other. She refused. Not that day, nor the next, when he came back with the same proposal and the same patience in his eyes. Margaret had pride, and that pride was one of the few things Thomas hadn't taken with him when he left. She would not marry for convenience, no matter how much she needed to. There was something inside her that refused to accept that her life had come down to this kind of negotiation. But William Fletcher was a persistent man, and persistence in the American West was often accompanied by a deep understanding of how hard life could be on those who had no choice. On the third day, he did not make the proposal again. Instead, I brought a pair of small shoes and a rag doll. To Sarah, he said simply, because a child should not pay for the pride of adults. Margaret stood still, holding her small shoes in her hands, feeling the soft leather between her calloused fingers. Sarah ran up to her with her eyes shining, hugging the doll as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. The girl had no idea of the weight of that gift, of the silent message that William Fletcher had left there in the dust of the boarding house. The farmer did not wait for thanks. He put the hat back on his head, made a respectful gesture with the brim, and walked away slowly as if he had all the time in the world. Margaret watched him until he disappeared around the bend in the main street, and only then did she realize she was holding her breath. Sarah had already put on her shoes and was dancing in circles, laughing in a way that Margaret hadn't heard in months. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep cuddling with the new doll, Margaret sat on the narrow bed, looking out of the small bedroom window. The moon was full and illuminated the low-rise buildings of Cedar Falls, creating long shadows that stretched across the empty street. She thought of Thomas, as she always did on sleepless nights. He remembered how he used to say that one day they would be rich, that they would find gold in the mountains or fertile lands further west, Promises that went up in smoke when he left on any given morning, leaving only debts and a broken family. The following days brought a strange routine. Margaret continued to wash clothes in the creek, but now William Fletcher appeared regularly in town. I didn't talk to her. I didn't insist on the proposal, but I always found a way to help. When the laundry cart broke down, it appeared repaired the next morning. When Sarah fell ill with a fever, a bottle of medicine appeared on the bedroom door, along with a note that simply said, "For the girl." Margaret began to watch Fletcher more closely. He saw how he treated his own children when they came to town with him, the patience in his gestures, the care in the way he helped the youngest get off his horse. He noticed that he always greeted people with respect, from the pastor of the church to the old Pete who swept the streets. There was a solidity in this man, something that reminded him of distant mountains, immovable, reliable, permanent. The turning point came on a stormy afternoon. The wind had knocked down several trees in the city, and the ensuing rain turned the streets into rivers of mud. Margaret and Sarah were trapped in the boarding house room when they heard knocking on the door. It was Fletcher, soaked from head to toe, carrying a flashlight and a worried expression. The bridge over the stream had been blown away, and the barn where Margaret kept her clean clothes was flooded. Weeks of work were lost in a few hours, along with the little money she had managed to save. Margaret looked at the muddy water that carried pieces of fabric through the current and felt something break inside her chest. It wasn't just the lost work. It was the confirmation that no matter how hard she tried, the world always found a way to remind her of her condition. Fletcher didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood beside her watching the destruction, the lantern creating a faint circle of light in the middle of the darkness. When she finally spoke, her words were as soft as the rain that was still falling. She offered shelter to her and Sarah until the storm passed. "Not at the ranch," he explained, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. He had a small house in the city which he used when he stayed late, taking care of business. It was simple, but dry and hot. Margaret accepted, not out of pride or stubbornness, but because Sarah was shivering with cold, and Mrs. Coleman's boarding house had also been hit by the flood. They followed Fletcher down the flooded street, Sarah holding her mother's arms, and the doll protected inside the cape that the farmer had offered. The house was really simple. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace that Fletcher lit as soon as they arrived. There was dry firewood piled up next to the wall, and clean blankets in the rooms. Margaret realized that the place was always ready to welcome someone, as if Fletcher knew that one day it would be needed. That first night, sitting in front of the fire while Sarah slept in the next room, Margaret finally allowed the tears to fall. They were not tears of self-pity, but of a deep tiredness that he had been carrying for months. Fletcher didn't try to console her with empty words. He just placed a cup of hot tea next to her and sat down in the opposite armchair, respecting her need to cry in peace. It was then that Margaret began to understand that Fletcher's proposal had never been about convenience. It was about 2 people who had lost something important, finding a way to rebuild their lives together. It wasn't fairy tale love, but perhaps it was something stronger. It was 2 people's conscious choice to care for each other in a world that seemed determined to break anyone who lacked support. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret discovered that there was a difference between accepting help out of desperation and accepting help out of recognition that some people are trustworthy. Fletcher never pressed, never mentioned her original proposal, but her constant and gentle presence began to melt the defenses she had built around her heart. Sarah flourished in that environment. The girl helped Fletcher tend the horses when he came to town, and he taught with a patience that Margaret did not know existed in men. She watched through the kitchen window as Fletcher showed her daughter how to brush the animals' manes, how to offer carrots without frightening, how to recognize the signs that a horse was happy or nervous. Sarah laughed more in those weeks than she had in months. The reconstruction of the city after the storm brought work for everyone. Margaret found employment cooking for the workers repairing the bridge and damaged buildings. Fletcher organized the crews and oversaw the heavier work, always showing up for dinner at the small house later in the day. They were not long conversations, but they were real conversations. He would ask about her day, she would ask about the ranch, and Sarah would fill the silences with stories of the discoveries she made exploring the city. One evening, while washing the dinner dishes, Margaret realized that she no longer thought about Thomas every day. The discovery scared her at first, as if she were betraying some sacred memory. But then he understood that it was not betrayal. It was healing. Fletcher wasn't trying to replace her past. He was helping to build something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. The transformation did not happen all at once, but in small moments. It was the morning that Fletcher brought wildflowers to Margaret, saying only that he had found them beautiful on the way. It was on the afternoon that she mended a shirt of his without him asking, simply because she noticed that it was torn. It was the night Sarah fell asleep between the two of them on the couch, and neither wanted to move so as not to wake her. Margaret began visiting Fletcher's ranch on Sundays. At first it was for Sarah to play with his sons, James and little Daniel. But soon Margaret found herself helping in the large kitchen of the main house, arranging meals for the workers, taking care of the boys when Fletcher needed to leave. The house had a different atmosphere from the city. It was quieter, closer to the earth and the sky, a place where the problems seemed smaller in the face of the vastness of the horizon. Fletcher's children received it without reservation. 12-year-old James had his father's serious eyes, but he smiled when Margaret made cookies. Daniel, only 5 years old, soon began calling her Mrs. Margaret, with the adorable formality of well-mannered children. Sarah adapted as if she had always belonged to this noisy and affectionate family. It was during one of these Sunday visits that Margaret finally understood why Fletcher had made his original proposal. It wasn't just because he needed a wife, or because she needed security. It was because he had recognized in her something she herself had forgotten she possessed: the ability to make a house a home, to care for people, to find joy in the simple details of everyday life. One afternoon, as Margaret watched the 4 children playing in the pasture near the house, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a sense of belonging, of being in the right place, surrounded by the right people. Fletcher appeared next to her, following her gaze towards the children. He talked about the wife he had lost, about how the house had become too quiet after her death, about how he had forgotten that a family was more than just people living in the same place. Margaret listened without interrupting, understanding that he was sharing something precious and painful. When he finished speaking, Margaret felt that the time had come to be equally honest. He spoke about Thomas for the first time since he had arrived in Cedar Falls. He told about the marriage that had started full of dreams and ended in abandonment, about the broken promises, about the fear of trusting again. Fletcher listened to every word without judgment, his quiet eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When Margaret finished her story, Fletcher just nodded, as if he fully understood the pain in her words. Then, very softly, he repeated his original proposal. Not as a trade deal this time, but as an invitation to start over together, to build something new on the foundations of what they had both lost. Margaret looked at the children playing, at the house that seemed to yearn for laughter and conversation, at the man next to her who had proved his goodness through deeds, not words. And for the first time since Thomas left, she felt that perhaps she deserved a second chance to be happy. Margaret's answer came not in words, but in a simple movement of approximation. She reached out and lightly touched Fletcher's arm, a small gesture that carried the weight of a decision that would change both lives. He understood immediately, and the smile that appeared on his face was like the sunrise after a long winter night. The wedding was simple, held in the small church of Cedar Falls on a Saturday morning when the heat had not yet become oppressive. Margaret wore a light blue dress that had belonged to the pastor's wife, hastily adjusted by Mrs. Coleman. Sarah carried a bouquet of wildflowers that she had chosen herself, and Fletcher's children stood by their father's side during the ceremony, serious as little men fulfilling an important duty. The Cedar Falls community turned out in droves, not just out of curiosity, but out of genuine affection for the bride and groom. Fletcher was respected for his honesty in business and his generosity to neighbors in need. Margaret had won the affection of the people during the difficult months after the storm, when she cooked tirelessly for the reconstruction workers without ever accepting extra pay. The move to the ranch brought challenges that Margaret had not anticipated. The house was large, but it had been arranged by a widowed man who prioritized functionality over comfort. The rooms were sparse, the kitchen efficient but cold, and there was a general absence of details that transform a building into a home. Margaret started slowly, adding curtains to the windows, rearranging the furniture to create more welcoming spaces, filling the house with scents of fresh bread and stews. The children adapted more quickly than the adults. Sarah shared a room with little Daniel, and soon the two were inseparable, inventing games and exploring every corner of the ranch. It took James, more reserved, a few weeks to fully accept Margaret, but she earned his trust through patience and small gestures of care, such as mending her favorite clothes or preparing her favorite dishes. Fletcher and Margaret discovered that living together was different from spending pleasant afternoons talking. There were moments of discomfort when the habits of years of solitary life came into conflict. Fletcher was used to waking up before dawn and heading out into the countryside without telling anyone. Margaret, for her part, had developed strict routines to keep tabs on her uncertain life, and she needed to know where everyone was at any given moment. But there were also wonderful discoveries. Fletcher had a dry sense of humor that only appeared when he felt completely at ease. Margaret discovered that she could sing, something she had forgotten during the difficult years with Thomas. The evenings became warmer as she hummed while sewing, and Fletcher played harmonica by the fireplace. The first serious conflict came when Margaret tried to change the way Fletcher disciplined her children. She thought he was too strict, especially with James, who was entering his teens. Fletcher, for his part, felt that Margaret was too permissive with Sarah, too pampering a child who needed to learn about responsibility. The argument was neither loud nor cruel, but it was the first time that both understood that marrying out of mutual necessity did not automatically eliminate personality differences. Reconciliation came through the children themselves. One afternoon, when Margaret and Fletcher were still politely avoiding each other after the argument, James injured himself trying to tame a young foal. Margaret rushed to help without hesitation, wiping the cut on the boy's forehead and treating it with the same tenderness she would use with Sarah. Fletcher watched as she muttered reassuring words as she bandaged the wound, and understood that her affection for his children was genuine, not just part of the duties of a wife. That night, after the children went to sleep, Margaret and Fletcher talked honestly about their fears. She admitted that she was afraid that she would not be good enough as a mother to his children, that she would never be able to completely replace the woman they had lost. Fletcher confessed that he feared that Margaret would regret having accepted a life so different from what she had imagined when she first married. The conversation went on until late, and it was that night that they both understood that love had not come as a sudden thunderbolt, but as the gradual growth of a carefully watered plant. Margaret realized that she had stopped comparing Fletcher to Thomas because Fletcher was completely different. Solid where Thomas had been unstable, present where Thomas had been absent, honest where Thomas had been full of empty promises. Fletcher, for his part, discovered that he was not trying to replace his deceased wife with Margaret. It was a different kind of love, built on different foundations, not the fiery passion of youth, but the conscious choice of two mature people to build happiness together, despite the scars they both carried. It was on that night, under the endless stars of the western sky, that William Fletcher and Margaret finally became truly husband and wife. Not just on paper, but in heart. The first year of marriage passed like an entire season, bringing subtle changes that completely transformed the atmosphere of the ranch. The house now breathed life through the details Margaret had added. Embroidered pillows on the sofas, herbs drying in the kitchen, photographs of the children arranged over the fireplace. The place had truly become a home, not just a shelter. Sarah turned 9 at a party organized by the whole family. Margaret watched her daughter blow out the candles on the cake they had made together, surrounded by her foster siblings and the man who had become the father she never had. The girl didn't ask about Thomas anymore. The past had been replaced by a present full of security and love. It was one autumn night, when the first rains began to fall on the roof of the house, that Margaret finally found the courage to tell William the whole truth about her first marriage. The children slept soundly, and the fire in the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls of the room. William was repairing a harness, his deft hands working as he listened. Margaret started slowly, explaining how she had met Thomas at a church party when she was only 18. He was handsome and full of big dreams, talking about golden lands in the West and fortunes waiting to be discovered. He was 5 years older than her, and he seemed to know the world in a way that Margaret found fascinating. They married 3 months later, against the advice of her parents, who thought Thomas was too unstable to be a good husband. The first few years had been difficult, but not unhappy. Thomas worked when he found a job, but he was always planning the next move, the next opportunity that would make them rich. They moved 4 times in 5 years, always following some rumor about work or cheap land. Margaret learned to make a house anywhere, to stretch every penny to the limit, to smile when Thomas came home full of impossible plans. Sarah was born during a particularly difficult spring, when Thomas was trying to establish a small farm on land he later discovered did not belong to him. Margaret took care of her newborn daughter practically alone, because Thomas spent entire days in town, trying to solve the property's legal problems. It was during this time that she began to realize that her husband's dreams were greater than his ability to make them come true. The definitive change in Thomas's character happened after they lost the farm. He started drinking more, spending whole weeks away from home, always chasing some opportunity that never materialized. Margaret took over the family's livelihood, washing clothes and sewing for neighbors. Thomas accepted the money she earned without shame, but never thanked her for the sacrifice she made. The morning he left had begun like any other. Thomas woke up early, as he always did when he was planning to go out, but this time there was something different about the way he dressed, how he packed his few belongings in a travel bag. Margaret pretended to sleep, but watched his every move through her intertwined eyelids. The note he left on the kitchen table was cruel in its simplicity. He only said that he had found an opportunity in another state, that he would send money as soon as he settled down, that it was better this way for everyone. He didn't mention Sarah, he didn't say goodbye, he didn't ask for forgiveness. It was as if 5 years of marriage could be summed up in 3 sentences, written in a hurry on a cheap sheet of paper. Margaret waited 6 months for news of him. After a year, he began to accept that Thomas would not return and would not send money. After 2 years, she stopped waiting altogether and began to consider herself a widow, although technically she was still married to a man who had simply disappeared from her life. The most painful part of the story was not the abandonment itself, but the way Thomas had gradually destroyed Margaret's self-esteem. In the later years of their marriage, he often suggested that she wasn't smart enough to understand his plans, wasn't pretty enough to attract better opportunities to the family, wasn't brave enough to accompany him on the adventures he planned. Margaret had begun to believe these criticisms, to see herself through her husband's disappointed eyes. When she finished telling the story, Margaret realized that she was crying silently. They were not tears of sadness for the past, but of relief for finally having shared the weight she had been carrying for so long. William had stopped working on the harness and was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. He stood up slowly and sat down next to her on the couch, pulling her gently into his arms. He offered no empty words of comfort or promises that all would be well. Instead, he just held her as she cried, his presence solid and reassuring like the mountains surrounding the ranch. When Margaret finally calmed down, William spoke for the first time since she had begun the story. His words were simple but full of meaning. He said that Thomas had been a fool for abandoning something so precious, that Margaret was the strongest and bravest woman he knew, that Sarah was a blessing that any man would be honored to call his daughter. But more important than words was what William did in the days that followed. He continued to treat Margaret exactly as he had always treated her, with respect and affection, as if knowing the whole truth about her past didn't change anything about who she was in the present. She proved through actions that Thomas's criticisms had been cruel lies, that Margaret was valuable, intelligent, and courageous. That spring, nearly 2 years into their marriage, Margaret finally realized that she had found something she didn't even know she was looking for. Not just a second husband, but a true companion, someone who saw her as she really was, and chose to love her not despite her imperfections, but including them. The ranch thrived under the combined care of William and Margaret. The children grew up strong and happy, united as true siblings. And Margaret discovered that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as practical proposals, offered by men who understand that true love is built day after day, choice after choice, through small acts of kindness that accumulate until they become a lifetime of shared happiness. His daughter never needed shoes that the family could not afford again, and William's cabin never needed a woman again, because he had found not only a wife, but a true partner for all the seasons of life. If this story has touched your heart, you will love our channel dedicated to the most exciting narratives of the American Wild West. Here, you'll find stories of redemption, true love, and second chances, all set in the arid and challenging settings that have shaped the character of brave men and women. Each episode brings unforgettable characters facing deep moral dilemmas, where justice doesn't always come with a badge, and love can flourish in the most unlikely places. Don't miss out on any of our weekly adventures in the heart of the Wild West. Subscribe now and activate the bell to be notified whenever a new story arrives on our channel.